All right. Well, I already told you who our next speaker was, and I get to ask him if the internet really is a series of tubes. If you want to feel like you're not doing enough with your life, Vint has 29 honorary degrees. He is widely recognized as one of the creators of the internet, largely because of his work on TCP/IP. TCP/IP is the protocol that pushes bits from me to you right now. So we are coming to you live thanks to my next guest. Good morning, Vint. How are you?
Good morning. It's lovely to see you, and it was wonderful to listen to your conversation with Amanda. She's always fun to listen to, isn't she?
Absolutely. So you built the tubes, right?
Well, it's true that there are a bunch of tubes through which the packets go, and the thing that the senator didn't understand, or perhaps it wasn't explained to him, is that inside of the tubes are little electronic postcards, and they get switched. Not like circuit switching, but packet switching. And I think that may have not have quite registered.
Yeah, I think simulated tubes atop envelopes flying back and forth very quickly with addresses that have a finite number of postal delivery men. Like that analogy is going to stretch to breaking point very, very quickly, I think. So Vint, you have some remarks for us and some things to say, and then I'm going to check back, but I'll leave you the stage and we'll be back in a few minutes.
Thank you so much, Alistair. Well, I've got this 20-minute peroration. I was asked, what does it take to make society better with technology? And the one word that occurred to me is inclusion. And if you think a little bit about how powerful that term is, how all-encompassing it can be, it's a very helpful framing to answer that question. So one of the things that I believe we need out of technology is universal access. We want it to work for everyone. And that means that all of the technology we use needs to exhibit certain kinds of properties. And so I'll call them desirable properties. And I would say it's not necessarily the case for every instance of technology that all of these properties hold. But think for just a moment more generally. First of all, we want the technology to be reliable. We want it to be safe. We want it to be secure. We want our privacy to be protected. We want it to be sustainable because you don't want it to go away. We want it to be affordable because otherwise nobody's going to use it. We want it to address accessibility in both senses, one for people who need assistive technology and the other just generally able to get access. For example, if there's no internet available, then you can't use it. If there are no towers and cell facilities available, then you can't use it. So accessibility is important. And I would say that transparency is important here too. And the reason for that is that you want people to be able to understand and anticipate how the system is going to behave. You want it to be relatively predictable, because why would anybody want to use technology that was unpredictable? It's like a light switch that only works 65% of the time. And I'm sure you can make up other examples. Now, as we start to inject technology into daily use, then we have to ask ourselves what kinds of hazards might there be to be concerned about, either in the design stages or the implementation and deployment and use stages. So we already know that in the internet context, it's possible to abuse what is otherwise relatively neutral technology. So think about malware, distributed denial of service attacks, disinformation, stalking, bullying, fraud, theft, all the various ills that also take place in the physical world can also take place in the online world. And in some sense, it's worse because in the online world, distance has been erased. And so people can be in juxtaposition in the network, even when they're physically very separate. I bet some of you have also noticed that while we're erasing distance, we haven't erased time zones. And so for these kinds of meetings, some people are up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And we don't know how to solve that problem yet. But the implication of these concerns is that we need guardrails. And those guardrails can come in a number of different forms. Some of them could be technical. We can actually try to inhibit harmful behavior by building technology against it, but that doesn't always work. Then we could probably put in some legal guardrails that say, if we catch you doing these things, there will be consequences. We do this all the time. Think about cars and alcohol. We tell people, don't drink and drive. And if we catch you doing that, there will be consequences. We'll take your license away, or there'll be a fine, or maybe both. And then even if we can't succeed in stopping bad behaviors that way, there's one other possibility, and we'll call it norms. And I think social norms are a very, very important part of the way our society functions. It doesn't function solely on the basis of law. It also functions on the basis of social norms that we adopt. So I can imagine saying to people about some of the bad behaviors online, don't do that. It's just not, it's wrong. It's just morally wrong. And although that sounds wimpy in a way, I remind you that gravity is the weakest force in the universe. And yet when there's enough mass, it's very powerful. And if you think of social mass, of people adopting broadly a set of norms, that can apply a fair amount of pressure to the rest of the society to behave in accordance with those norms. So those are my, three kinds of pills you can take to deal with this. Now, what else do we have to worry about in technology? Well, think a little bit about machine learning, which is a very popular element or form of AI right now. And we're discovering that it's possible to train these things to be biased, or we can train them and then they turn out to be brittle because there are certain combinations of input that it didn't anticipate, that didn't get trained in the neural network, and it breaks in some unexpected and possibly catastrophic way. It's sort of like the image recognition system that's looking at a cat and announces that it's a fire engine. And there are reasons why those things happen, but we can't always predict them ahead of time. I would say that accessibility problems are really tough. Accommodation for various kinds of disability is not easy. And the reason it's not easy is that figuring out how to design a system that can compensate for a broad range of difficulty, whether it's vision impairment, hearing impairment, motor impairment, cognitive impairment, because those are spectra, they're not just simple points. Figuring out how to design technology that will adapt to those things so as to make the technology inclusive is actually quite hard. I don't think we have the depth of knowledge that we would like, or I would like, to do a good job of prescribing how to do accessible design. That's something that we need to turn to our academics and to others to improve. I will say also, and Amanda brought this up as well, and that's education. People need to be digitally literate. And in order to do that, they have to be aware of, in some sense, of how things work and how to anticipate how they work. They also have to anticipate how they might not work, how they might break, and be cautious and be thoughtful, knowing what risk factors there might be. So as an example, when someone is doing email, we should teach them that some email may be attempting to phish them, to get them to click on something that could be harmful, either taking them to a website that wants to capture their identity, or ingesting a piece of software that becomes malware that turns into a keylogger and is observing them as they're logging in, or doing some other kind of bad thing. And so we should teach people to be more suspicious about email that comes in, even if it's coming from someone you think it is a friend. If it looks a little odd, or, why does it say, go click on this right now? You might send that to your friend that it appears to have come from and say, don't click on anything, but did you send this? And that's not a bad kind of practice to consider. So we need to teach people about that. And the second thing, and the thing that Code for America does so beautifully, is to teach people critical thinking. And I think of this as kind of the scientific method. You have a problem, you break it down into pieces, you try to figure out how to solve the pieces, then you try to figure out how to put them all back together again, and then you test to see whether or not it works. If it doesn't work, there might be something wrong with the design, or maybe you didn't put it together properly. That's kind of like a scientist with a theory doing a test to justify or verify the theory and finding that the test doesn't match the predictions. So now what's wrong? Maybe you screwed up the experiment, or maybe your theory is wrong. And if you're a good scientist, you realize you may have to redo your theory, even though you've been hugging it to your chest for the last 20 years. So critical thinking is very important for everyone to learn. And that's why I like the idea of Code for America and other maker spaces and other things that introduce these kinds of concepts early on to young people, so that they can hang on to those skills towards the end. Finally, I wanted to mention one other thing about technology, which I worry about. If we go digital, I'm very concerned about the preservation of digital content for several reasons, not the least of which is preserving things in perpetuity for long periods of time for your descendants, your kids, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. Think about all the photographs that are on people's mobile phones. And they assume that they're just going to be there forever, or maybe they've uploaded them into the cloud somewhere and they hope the cloud will be there forever. We really need to think about how deeply dependent people are on digital technologies and on the preservation of digital content, because so much more information is born that way and is accumulating over time. So how do we make sure that the information that you care most about is going to be around in 100 or 200 or 500 years? And there's a lot of bits and pieces that you have to worry about there. Intellectual property, for example, becomes a big issue. What if someone says, I know you use this particular piece of software, you created a lot of digital content with it, but now we're going to retire it and we're not going to support it anymore. And you say, but I have all this content that I created with it and I still need it to work. And somebody might say, well, I'm sorry, we can't afford to maintain it forever. So maybe there needs to be an escrow arrangement where the software source code could be available for somebody else who's willing to take on the task of maintaining it. Or maybe you need to record hardware designs so that you could run an old computer in a virtual machine to run an old piece of software that is not being maintained anymore, so you can get access to your digital files. Just think about all those variations that we should be worried about in order to assure that as we move into this digital world and say that it's a good place to be, that we've taken into account a lot of those issues. So these are the kinds of things that occupy my thinking, and I can guarantee you they occupy the thinking of a lot of people at Google as well, to assure that the use of digital technology is in fact going to be beneficial for everyone. And keeping that in the backs of our minds as we design and build new products and services seems to me to be a vital goal for all of us to follow. So now I'm very interested in having a chance to hear what Alistair has to say about some of these ideas. I'm sure he's got questions, and maybe some of you do as well. So, Alistair.
Do I ever? So Vint, that was a lot of great content, and I think I speak on behalf of everybody. And I can tell you, I'm looking over here in the chat, the number of people who are like, it's great to see you thinking about these issues around inclusion and accessibility and so on, is heartening. I talked to Paul Makapetris, who you know, who invented DNS, another piece of the technologies on which we rely, and SMTP. And I said, so, how'd you build these things? And Paul said, well, I got fed up of writing down IP addresses on Post-it notes.
Right, yeah.
So I figured I'd build DNS so that I could type in a memorable name. And I was like, oh, so your design brief was replace Post-it notes with, if you even had Post-it notes, with like little numbers on them. And he said, yeah, for SMTP, well, I took MTP, which was the mail transport protocol, very complicated protocol, and I decided it didn't need all these things like multi-stage authentication, and DNS didn't need all this stuff like X500 and certificates. So I got rid of those. And I said, so you basically made all spam possible. Now, Paul didn't like that answer, but he said, so if you take out authentication for DNS and you take out authentication for SMTP, you're responsible for spam. So my point here is the unintended consequences of what you're building. As you said, we need to think better about these children that we're giving birth to. And we also need to think better about how to retire them when they get too old. So I want to focus on the birthing of new technological children and their retirement. It's impossible for Paul to anticipate Viagra spam and malware when he's just fed up with writing down IP addresses. At what point do we say, here's what you can anticipate, and here's where we need to do large-scale refactoring of what we've built because now it has new purposes?
Or it has new uses or abuses, and I think that's important. Let me back up just a little bit with your Paul Makapetris story and tell you about the engine of innovation. The engine of innovation is basically discontent. And I remember writing an article called "In Praise of Discontent," and then the reason is if nobody is discontented, nothing changes. It's people who are not happy with the status quo that cause change. And so that's sort of where a lot of this stuff starts. Somebody not happy with the way things work now, and I'm one of them. So now, but that now gets us to the point you were making, which is that sometimes when we resolve this discontent by inventing a new way to do things, we're not capable of fully appreciating how it might be abused. And I remind you that we still read Shakespeare's plays 400 years after they were written, because they expose all the foibles of human personality, including the bad side. In fact, a lot of it's the bad side. So, and that hasn't changed. And so we now realize that when people get their hands on technology, some of them will use it for their own purposes that may not necessarily be in your best interest. So now our problem is how to build guardrails and to constrain. So let me come back now to your question about anticipating things that might go wrong. I would argue that we don't necessarily have as much of a discipline as we would like. Think about engineers, civil engineers. We turn to them and say, please build me safe bridges, safe buildings, and so on. And we say, here's a code, a building code that we've adopted, which should ensure, or at least make more probable, that the building and the bridge won't collapse. And those engineers get certificates that qualify them. They have to pass exams and so on to be civil engineers. And we don't let randoms sign off on those specs.
In Quebec, we actually give every engineer a ring made from the metal of a bridge that collapsed. So if you're an engineer in Quebec, you literally get this ring when you graduate that reminds you to pay attention.
Well, I was expecting you to cut off the finger of the engineer who So we'll come back now to this problem that you're highlighting, which is how do we anticipate and predict? And the answer is we're not very good at that. To be honest with you, when we start looking at malware and things like that, we sometimes actually turn to the bad guys, and some of whom have switched hats from black hats to white hats, to find out to catch a thief. You remember the theme there. Learning how people can abuse things is very important, and it's something we have to be open to. I don't anticipate that we will always predict the things that could happen. So we have to be alert to that. And that means collecting quite a bit of information to figure out what could go wrong or what is going wrong. And talk to any of the security people, and they'll tell you data is the lifeblood of security.
And that just came up in the conversation with Amanda, the fact that we built these institutions after the Great Depression to sort of get the pulse of the nation. But it feels like those systems were built for an analog world. One of the themes that keeps coming up this week is this idea that the costs and what's scarce and what's abundant in digital is vastly different from what's scarce and abundant in the physical world. Personalization is extremely expensive in the physical world. It's the default in the digital world, for example. Veracity is pretty easy to verify when someone's right in front of you, really hard online with deepfakes, right? So it does seem, I love this idea. I love that you said Shakespeare and you actually factored in discontent. So I totally got that. But maybe we need to say that this is the spring of our discontent and not the winter, that we are giving birth to new things by this frustration. And that's what society is going through right now, is we are discontented with the analog norms that no longer apply in a digital world. And as a result, we need to recalibrate everything. We need to recalibrate how political systems work, how the market works. Tim O'Reilly was on yesterday talking about monopolies. This idea that, a monopoly was, I have access to all the resources, and now it might be I have access to an attention graph, for example. And we don't really have laws. We don't really have norms for digital. We're figuring those out. This is still 10 or 20 years old. So I love the idea of teaching people critical thinking and saying, what didn't you anticipate? But how do we as a society figure out when the discontent is big enough to justify refactoring something without it boiling over into, rioting in the streets?
Well, of course, rioting in the streets does happen too. It's certainly a big signal. First of all, we don't have to do everything all at once, fortunately. That's why God invented time, so not everything has to happen at the same time. And so we can work our way into some of these things and learn from them. And I'm a big fan of iteration. We went through 4 different cycles of internet design, for example, before we settled on what we're roughly speaking using now. And so this iterative approach is terribly important. You learn from things. You learn from what works. You learn from what doesn't work. You learn from other people. And so one of the things that is implicit in what Amanda is doing is that there are a large number of experiments that can happen concurrently in the digital world, which would not be feasible in the more physical world. I do want to argue with you, though, that we are not just dissatisfied with the analog world. I think we're dissatisfied with the digital one, too. And the reason is that we have risks and uncertainties, the ones that you implied. Let me give you an example. A piece of information comes in an online forum. Where did it come from? How should I evaluate it? If I knew more about where it came from or whether there was corroborating evidence, this is all part of critical thinking. Don't you think that strong authentication might be our friend here? Not arguing that everyone needs to identify themselves strongly for every action that they take, but for certain kinds of actions, if they're willing, if they're expressing an opinion and they're willing to identify themselves strongly, that might give more weight to that opinion than the one which is totally anonymous. And I realize I'm leaving out, the whistleblower problems. And
No, but the idea of digital provenance is a fascinating one. I think you're spot on there. I want to come back to one thing you said quickly about what happens to things when they end, if they still have a public value but not a market value. Google Reader, I'm looking at you. I loved Google Reader. Do you think there's a model for public sector to become the escrow? Because the government tends to deploy things that have a public good, but are not supported by the market factors of profit and motive. What about a model of public sector escrow where the tech companies say, I don't need this anymore, but you can have it?
So I think that we sort of practice that by open source software practices at Google, which is another way of dealing with the problem. It's not escrow. It's more like just here it is and so on. And people can maintain it if they want to. I think creating business models that allow support for things that have reached what other business might say end of life is end of life is actually kind of important. I rant on this topic all the time on other matters like repair of physical devices that are designed to be not repairable. And, I won't repeat the kind of words that come to my mind when I'm
right to repair. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that we should be thinking about longevity. We should be thinking about sustainability, especially for things that are still useful, even if they aren't necessarily useful as a revenue producing business. Although, coming back to maintaining things on behalf of other people, it could be that they'll be willing to pay for that.
Absolutely. Well, I for one am very glad that you're thinking about the spring of our discontent, and that you do have the influence to see where your progeny have gone, because it must be amazing to think you built a thing that was a series of virtual tubes, and it's come to having conversations with people in a pandemic around the world over those tubes. So thank you very much for your incredible contribution to society, and just for being a genuinely interesting person to talk with. I've got a long page of questions we don't have time for, but maybe we'll get a chance to have that conversation in person when this is all behind us.
I would look forward to that, Alistair. Thanks so much for having me on the show. Take care.
Thank you.